All righty. Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. This webinar will be talking about a really great project that CalSTART, Empire Clean Cities, and some of our other great partners have been undertaking for the last couple of years to understand the ins and outs of medium and heavy duty vehicle deployment, specifically EVs, in lots of different applications and of different areas in the US. Really excited to get started. With me on this webinar is Mark Hill from CalSTART, Christina Doblare from CalSTART, and myself and Laura Kelkovic from Empire Clean Cities. Next slide. So just a quick agenda for us here today. We'll give a little bit of an introduction to the project and to who we are, Empire Clean Cities. And then CalSTART will talk to us about this really interesting study. We'll go through the project overview and some of the really great data and insights that they got from the fleets that participated in the study about EV duty cycles and performance, some of the sort of variations in between regions and vehicles, and some survey results that we got from some sort of qualitative interviews with fleets from across the country, and some key learnings and takeaways and recommendations that fleets who are adopting EVs moving into this decade can take moving forward. And we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end. Next slide. So ECC is a New York-based 501c3 not-for-profit environmental organization. We are part of the larger Clean Cities Network, which now has over 75 different clean cities and communities coalitions that are committed to ensuring clean air for future generations by providing their citizens and their stakeholders with reliable information about alternative fuel vehicles and advanced vehicle technologies. And Mission Electric is Empire Clean Cities' electric vehicle campaign and resource hub, which provides information about EVs and electrified transport to car buyers, to fleets, and to all the stakeholders in our New York State region. Next slide. Our team is really heavily focused on ensuring that mission of ensuring clean air for future generations with an environmental justice approach, and by managing a broad suite of programs that are focused on all sorts of alternative fuels, including especially electric vehicles, but now includes hydrogen, as well as renewable liquid fuels like biodiesel. Next slide. As Empire Clean Cities, we provide education and outreach materials to decision makers and fleets that help them plan for their alternative fuel vehicle projects. That includes workforce development and training, and providing access to technical assistance through many of the programs that we participate in with some of the really great folks, some of whom I see on this call. We help connect fleets and municipalities with alternative fuel providers, with vehicle makers, OEMs, industry partners, and more, as well as resources to help them get started deploying alternative fuel vehicles and reducing their petroleum usage. We also help identify funding and incentive opportunities for our partners, and collect and analyze regional data that helps paint a picture of where the alternative fuel vehicle market and our impacts on reducing petroleum-based emissions are at in a regional sense, and sort of paint that more national picture with all of our other great Clean Cities partners. Next slide. The Clean Cities Network, as I mentioned, is a broad nationwide network. There are over 75 of us, with 6 here in New York State. We cover New York City and the Hudson Valley, but we've also got some great partners upstate and down on Long Island. The Clean Cities and Communities program is celebrating 30 years last year, and is a really wide network. So if you are not based in the New York City area, be sure to take a look at this map and see where your local Clean Cities Coalition may be, and get in touch with them, because they are great resources for finding funding and for working with them on any projects where you might need community engagement support or anything like that. We're a great network of folks to know. Really love being a part of such a big network. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Mark here from CalSTART to give a little background on this project and talk about the results. Mark?
Yeah, thank you, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Hill. I'm a project manager too at CalSTART, and joining me today is also Christina Doblier. She's our data analyst at CalSTART, and we both worked on the medium and heavy duty EV data collection project, which is collecting data from medium and heavy duty EVs across the US. So next slide, please. So I'm gonna go, this is our agenda. We're gonna talk a little bit about the project. We're gonna give a brief overview, and then we're gonna go into our duty cycle and performance by vehicle platforms. Christina is gonna be touching on that, as well as our regional variation and vehicle comparisons. And then we're gonna go into our survey results that we took from fleets in the field. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up with our key learnings and recommendations. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit of an overview about the project. So as I mentioned before, this project was to collect data from medium and heavy duties across the US. We collected data from over 200 vehicles across 10 different states. So can you go to the next slide, please? One of the motivations behind this was that data is lacking for EVs in this industry. So why is that? Because there's several barriers to adoption that still exist for different medium and heavy duty applications. Uh, those barriers would be range, efficiency impacts, such as due to weather, terrain, also our duty cycle suitability. Not all EVs, the technology is still coming online, so it may not be suitable for that duty cycle, but that is changing. And so also infrastructure availability. So these, as we know, EVs need to charge in order to move. Without that, they are unable to meet their duty cycle demand. So unlike their counterpart, ICE vehicles, that poses a challenge. So next slide, please. So with this data, what we were hoping to do was close the knowledge gaps that we currently have and address them. So by doing this, it's going to help us improve our public understanding of the current deployments on medium and heavy duty EVs, which would be essential to help accelerate the adoption for these technologies. So a project objective, as we mentioned before, was to collect, validate, analyze, and provide summary results on operational data collected from more than 200 medium and heavy-duty EVs. One of the impacts this project is going to have is it's going to expand our national data set to better inform future policy and deployment decisions, as well as identification of regional and national trends in medium and heavy-duty deployments and operating performance. The project started way back in October of 2019, and we are just now wrapping up the project at the end of this month for March 2024. Next slide, please. So for this project, it wasn't just all on CalSTART. There were actually several partners, as well as our Clean City Coalition partners, as we have here today, Empire Clean Cities. So we have our technical, if you look on the left, we have our technical partner, which is UCR, the University of California, Riverside. They assisted CalSTART with data collection, as well as analyzing from certain fleets out in the West Coast. Then we also have our implementation partners on the right, which is Tetra Tech and Geotab and Vericity. Geotab and Vericity, we were our telematic providers. So they were the ones who actually provided the telematic or data logger devices to be installed on the vehicle platform so we could actually collect the data. Tetra Tech has also assisted UCR with processing and analyzing data. And so they were one of the implementation partners as well. So I already mentioned our Clean City Coalitions. David gave a very thorough introduction of what the Clean City Coalitions do across the US. And so we have also our national labs. They are under the umbrella of the Department of Energy. So they are the researchers who are going to be using these data sets to further advance the research on medium and heavy duty EVs. So we were supplying them with the data as well as special requests that they may have had. So now I'm going to hand it over to Christina. She's going to go more in depth about the data that we did collect and give you some uh, insights to what we found throughout this project.
Great, thank you, Mark. Next slide. All right, so going into the data set itself, we collected quite a number of different parameters, and this project was intended to collect data from both vehicles and chargers. We did not get nearly as much charging data as we received vehicle data, so today I'll be focusing primarily on the vehicle data, since that is what we have more of. So from the vehicle performance data set, that was collected by onboard data loggers, telematics devices that were installed in the vehicles. And we collected a number of different parameters about the vehicle's usage. So we had the number of trips taken on a certain day, the total distance that the vehicle traveled, total time it was running. So that's when the key is on and the engine's on. Total time driving, idling, the state of charge used from the battery, energy consumption, as well as the outdoor air temperature during usage. So most of these data parameters were actually collected by the loggers. Sometimes we didn't receive temperature data from the vehicle loggers. In those cases, we downloaded it from external sources, which are noted at the right here, and then appended that to the data set. And in addition to all of those actual vehicle performance parameters, we also collected a number of different attributes associated with the vehicle, just so that we could classify them and make more connections and derive more learnings from the actual data. So that included some vehicle specifications, things like weight class, battery size, vehicle platform, nominal range, things like that, as well as some fleet related characteristics like the region, the state it was located in, and the fleet size. Next slide, please. So this data set, which is available online on the DOE's Livewire website, comprises 210 different medium heavy duty EVs. We also had a few light duty vehicles, but today we're going to be focusing exclusively on the medium and heavy duty side. So 210 vehicles, 38 different fleets, and 10 US states. And those fleets are shown in this map at the right. You can see how this data set is divided up by region. A lot of the fleets did come from the West Coast, from California, because of many pilot and demo projects that CALSTART had been working on that were located in California. But we did also acquire data from quite a few fleets outside of California, notably in the Midwest, and some fleets in the Northeast and South regions. So from that data, we had 2.8 million miles driven by these vehicles and 5.1 million kilowatt hours charged. So that's a lot of data that we collected, quite exciting. 51,000 different vehicle days of data. So those are rows of data. And then across all of these vehicles, there was an average efficiency of 2.1 kilowatt hours per mile. Next slide, please. All right, so looking at the data set, looking at the vehicle diversity that we had 6 different vehicle platforms from the medium heavy duty side. So those are noted here. We had school buses, 30 different school buses, 100 different transit buses, quite a large group there, 10 different medium duty step vans. These are like your USPS trucks, things like that. 6 medium duty trucks, a little bit larger, and then 29 heavy duty class 7 and 8 trucks. And then finally, we had some off-road vehicles. We had 35 different yard tractors, and those are also visualized in the bar chart on the left. So looking at vehicle days of data, so the actual number of days that these vehicles were driving, the transit buses had the largest amount of data collected. They had nearly 30,000 vehicle days of data. So this data set is quite transit heavy, but we did try to diversify it as much as we could and include a variety of different vehicle platforms. Next slide, please. So looking at the data collection timeline, that's shown at right, we did begin data collection at the end of 2016 with a few transit buses, and it ended at the end, at the very beginning of this year, 2024, with our last school buses. So that's quite a range of dates. That's, yeah, long time period there. But we didn't truly start ramping up the data collection until around 2020. The first few years were rather minimal in terms of data collection and mostly transit focused. So we did begin with the transit buses. School buses, we added in around the middle of the project. And then heavy duty, medium duty trucks were added in kind of throughout in lesser quantities, as well as some yard tractors. So we did receive data from a variety of different telematics providers. Like Mark mentioned, we worked pretty closely with Geotab and Versity to install data loggers on a lot of vehicles. But we did also get data from proprietary data loggers that were installed in some vehicles by their manufacturers. So a lot of these fleets were fleets that CalSTART was already working with for different pilot and demo projects. And for those, we worked really closely, installed the vehicle loggers for them and monitored that data collection throughout the entire period. For some other fleets, it was more of a communication with that fleet coordination, and then they sent us historical data or gave us access to login portals to access that historical data that had already been collected. So it was a bit of a mix of different data collection methods, but all in all, just telematics providers. So next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to dive into some of our actual data findings, starting with duty cycles. Next slide. So looking at the distance that was traveled by these different vehicle types, we do have those vehicle types listed in the left-hand box plot. And just a note for this section. All of these vehicle types are very different. They have different duty cycles, different performance, and all of that means that the values that they have for some of these metrics will be quite different. But in this section, I'll be summarizing with mean values, which may take with a grain of salt since that varies quite a bit among the different vehicle platforms. So across all of these platforms, the average daily mileage was 64.3 miles per day. And as you can see, that does vary. The transit buses tend to have significantly higher daily mileages. Yard tractors, of course, they're off-road. They have much less. So that does vary. But it is a good indicator of what the technology can do and where we are in terms of range. So across all of these vehicles, the mean maximum daily mileage was 139 miles. So what that means is we took the maximum mileage of all of these vehicle platforms and then averaged them. So obviously that's skewed a little high because of our transit buses that go up to nearly 200 miles sometimes per day. School buses tend to have lower mileages compared to transit. That makes sense given that they're only making 2 trips per day rather than running all day. And then our heavy duty, medium duty trucks are kind of in the middle there depending on their duty cycle. So just to note about our truck data, none of them were long haul trucks. We only worked with regional and local haul trucks. So that's less than around 300 miles per day. Next slide, please. So looking at runtime, this is the time that the key is on and the vehicle engine is running, but not necessarily driving. We had 9 mean hours of runtime per day across all of these vehicle platforms with a mean maximum of 19 hours, which is quite high. And here there is even more variation in runtime than there was for distance. You can see that the school buses in particular, in this dark blue color, are not running for very long. They're only running for around 4 hours per day, which is what we would expect given what we know about school buses in the United States. Transit has a very large range of daily runtime and tends to run around 12 hours per day on average, which is quite long compared to school buses and trucks. Yard tractors have pretty long run times as well, but they're not moving as much during that time. Next slide, please. And then looking at driving speed, this does vary quite a bit as well, but it does tend to be around that 15.5 mile per hour range. So here we can see that the yard tractors driving very, very slow. Everything else is a little bit faster, kind of in that 10 to 40 mile per hour range. And on average, the mean maximum daily speed was 45.7 miles per hour. Next slide, please. All right, so looking now at energy use, SOC use, efficiency, things like that. Next slide. So across all of our vehicle platforms, we had a mean efficiency of 2.11 kilowatt hours per mile. This is quite good. For diesel vehicles, it's much higher, upwards of like 5, 6, 7, 8 kilowatt hours per mile, much more energy being used per mile driven. So here we can see that some vehicle types are more efficient than others. Like we might expect, trucks aren't the most efficient here. Sorry, I misspoke. Like we might expect, the school buses are a little more efficient than transit. This makes sense. They tend to be a little bit smaller. And then our trucks, this data is a little interesting. So here it says that the heavy duty trucks performed a little bit worse than the medium duty trucks and vans. This again is what we might expect, using more energy per mile because it's a heavier vehicle. So that is there. And then with yard tractors, they also were much more energy intensive than some of our lighter vehicles. So medium duty vans were the most efficient generally of all of the vehicle platforms we studied. And this is what we might expect given that they're quite small. Next slide. All right, so looking at SOC usage, this is the percent of the battery state of charge that's being used per day. So on average, across all of these vehicle platforms, 56.7% SOC was used per day. And that's good. That means only half of the battery is in use. And, you know, some of these fleets could maybe increase the daily routes of these vehicles if they wanted to, and they'd be okay to do that. The vehicles have sufficient range to support that. So that means that we're moving in a good direction in terms of operational range and the state of the technology. A lot of this SOC usage is quite similar among the different vehicles, despite those big variations in things like, you know, efficiency, or not, sorry, things like distance or runtime. So despite all of that, they're all using just a little bit more than half of their state of charge per day. And so also looking at the mean maximum SOC use per day, that is 223%. That's quite high, but that would be the case if there was midday charging, things like that. It's not all on a single trip, obviously, because that would be impossible. But again, generally, the vehicles didn't use that much. That was a very small percentage of the data where it was more than 100% SOC usage per day. Next slide. All right, so now let's dive more into some of these particular vehicle platforms and some key stats related to each of them. So first, we'll take a peek at buses. Next slide. All right, so these are our transit buses. We have daily duty cycle in blue and daily efficiency performance in green. And I didn't write daily here, but it is the daily summary here. So on average, a transit bus from this big 210 vehicle data set traveled 93.4 miles per day at a speed of 19.1 when driving, 19.1 miles per hour. It ran for 12.6 hours and it idled for 42.5% of those hours. So with all of that, the SOC used per day on average for transit was 68%, with an efficiency of 2.2 kilowatt hours per mile. So that just shows us what the current state is, what a lot of these vehicles can accomplish, what they were required to do, and what needs they met. So quite long run times, pretty long distances, and a significant portion of idling time. Next slide. So looking at some specific transit findings, we did do some temperature analysis with transit. So this plot on the right shows it shows a model that has average ambient temperature, outdoor air temperature on the x-axis and the efficiency on the y-axis. So we can see that there is a range between, around 40 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, where efficiency is minimized, where we have peak efficiency, the least amount of energy used per mile driven. As we get warmer, that efficiency becomes worse. As we get colder, that efficiency becomes much worse. So as we can see here, we found that the optimal ambient temperature for transit bus efficiency was around 81 degrees Fahrenheit when other variables were held constant. So that's where peak performance lies. When we decrease the temperature a bit, when we get into that 30-degree Fahrenheit to 55-degree Fahrenheit range, energy consumption per 100 miles increases by 1 to 2 kilowatt hours. So you're using 1 to 2 kilowatt hours more energy for each 100 miles driven. When we go to sub-freezing temperatures, to 0 Fahrenheit to 29 Fahrenheit, we saw that became even worse. You're using 2 to 3 kilowatt hours more energy per 100 miles. So this is something that's really important for fleet managers in regions with cold winters to note. You're going to have worse efficiency performance and as a result, a shorter operational range. So you might need to ensure that your vehicles have a higher nominal range than you might think you need just because of that worse performance. And we did see in our cold weather climates, a lot of fleets installed fuel-fired heaters, and this made it so that they were able to meet their range needs. Now, fuel-fired heaters, there are obviously issues with them. They're not a clean energy source, but if that's what makes the vehicle able to meet the range needs, that's an improvement over just a diesel-powered vehicle. So, it's an important step in the transition. Next slide, please. So looking at our school buses, these vehicles traveled 60 miles per day on average at a speed of 22.5 miles per hour, quite a bit faster driving than the transit buses. They had a runtime of 3.3 hours per day, 24.1% of which was spent idling. That's about half of the percent idling time of the transit buses. So school buses idle a lot less than transit, at least in our analysis. In terms of SOC usage, they used 54.6% of their state of charge on average, and had an efficiency of 1.8 kilowatt hours per mile, which is really good efficiency. That is quite efficient. So school buses generally shorter duty cycles, less idling time, faster speeds, and better efficiency than transit. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at some Colorado fleets that we had. And looking specifically at the effect of temperature, again, on vehicle efficiency. So our previous temperature slide was looking just at transit. This one's looking at a mix of transit and school buses, and we see the same exact trend. We have an area of peak efficiency. Here it's around 70 to 80 degrees, and that becomes much worse at lower temperatures and high temperatures. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's dive into trucks a bit. Next slide. So our first truck platform, the medium duty step van. These are typically delivery trucks, things like that. So these trucks operated for 7.8 hours per day. They drove 43 miles per day at a speed of 23 miles per hour. And of that 7.8 hours of runtime, they were idling for 57% of the time, which is really high. And this makes sense. They're stopping, they're starting, they're driving to different delivery locations, things like that. So it makes sense that they would be idling quite a bit. They used 55.9% of their state of charge, and they only used 1.2 kilowatt hours per mile. These are very, very efficient vehicles. They're relatively small compared to some of our other truck platforms, but for the duty cycle needs they have, that's very efficient, and that's a good sign. Next slide. Now looking at our medium duty trucks, these are box trucks, class 5, class 6. These guys drove 50.7 miles per day at a speed of 32.1 miles per hour. They were running for 3 hours a day, and they idled for 38% of the time. This is quite low compared to some of our other trucks. So maybe these ones were running more regional routes, not stopping and starting as much as some of our other trucks. Looking at SOC usage, they only used 41.3% of their SOC and only had 1.4 kilowatt hours per mile efficiency. So they're very efficient, not quite as efficient as the vans, but still very efficient. And these trucks weren't using very much of their battery capacity. They could have driven much further per day if they had if the fleet managers had wanted to. So this brings to light some concerns about things like range anxiety and utilizing the full operational range. Sometimes fleet managers won't use the full operational range because of range anxiety. We don't know what was the case here, whether that was just the vehicle routes or if it was because of perceived range limitations, but yeah, 41.3% SOC. Next slide, please. All right, and then finally we have finally of the trucks, we have our heavy duty trucks. So these trucks were driving about 60 miles per day at 17 miles per hour. They ran for 5.7 hours and 33.5% of those hours were spent idling, which is quite low. So 60 miles per day on average is pretty good. Obviously we know that long haul truck duty cycle needs are going to be much higher than that, but for regional trucking, that was sufficient for these fleets. 50% SOC means that they could have driven further. They could have driven nearly twice as many miles per day if fleets had wanted to. So, and then 2.1 kilowatt hours per mile, a little bit worse efficiency than our other truck platforms, which makes sense given the size of heavy duty trucks, but still very efficient. Next slide, please. All right, so here are two fleets we looked at from the Northeast region, kind of near our New York area. So we didn't get a ton of Northeast data, but these two trucking fleets in particular, we did receive data from, and they have fairly different efficiencies. So these fleets, one truck fleet used 3.6 kilowatt hours per mile, while a different one used 2.6 kilowatt hours per mile. And this just shows differences in things like duty cycle and routes on the impact, as well as the vehicle itself and its efficiency on what that operational efficiency and range looks like. So generally pretty good, but different. Next slide. All right, so finally, we're going to look at our yard tractor duty cycle and performance. So with these yard tractors, these off-road vehicles, they only drove 37 miles per day. This is really low compared to our other vehicle platforms, but that makes sense given that they're off-road vehicles. At only 4.6 miles per day, or miles per hour. So very, very slow speeds. Running for 10 hours per day, quite long, and idling for about 35.9% of that time. So with this duty cycle, the yard tractors used 48% of their state of charge, which is less than half, pretty low, could have used more, and had an efficiency of 2.2 kilowatt hours per mile, which is also quite good. Next slide, please. All right. So now we're going to take a look at some analyses that we conducted using this entire data set, some findings we gleaned from all of our vehicles combined. So we did an efficiency comparison analysis with these vehicles and compared them to their diesel counterparts. So across all of these vehicle platforms, we found that medium heavy duty EVs from this data set performed 3 to 6 times as efficiently as their diesel counterparts under real world conditions. So this is really good news. A lot of the time when we're looking at efficiency from the manufacturer, that's a nominal efficiency. That's a value under ideal circumstances, lab circumstances, not real world variations in climate and terrain and things like that. So here, 3 to 6 times as efficiently under real world conditions is very good. From that analysis, we then conducted an operational energy cost savings analysis to determine what those fuel cost savings might look like for all of these different vehicle platforms, given the average annual mileage that a vehicle of that platform travels. So what that means is we're looking at, like, if a transit bus travels the 8,700 miles per year that we saw in the data set, given the efficiency that we see in the data set, how much of a cost savings can we expect over time for that transit bus? And the same thing for all of the different vehicle categories. So that's shown in the plot at right. We're projecting cost savings per year from 2021 through 2035. So what we saw here is that all of our vehicle platforms were predicted to have operational cost savings. That doesn't include anything upfront, anything like that, but operational cost savings. The vehicle platforms that were projected to have the greatest cost savings were those with high mileage duty cycles that were also much more efficient than their diesel counterparts. So transit buses and heavy duty trucks ended up having the greatest projected energy cost savings. And this was because they travel the highest mileage out of the vehicles in this data set, as well as being much more efficient as EVs relative to diesel. Our lighter vehicles like school buses and medium duty step vans, these vehicles didn't have quite as much of an improvement in efficiency as the heavier ones. And this is just because the diesel versions are already relatively efficient compared to heavier diesel vehicles, if that makes sense. So the combination of those factors is what determines our cost savings. Next slide, please. All right, so looking at some regional variations, and like I said, we did have quite a range of regions. We had the West, Midwest, South, and Northeast represented in this data set to varying degrees. Next slide, please. All right, so we took the variations in climate and environment from these different vehicles, and we built out a machine learning model. So this was a model that was intended to predict vehicle efficiency and through that vehicle operational range. And this model took a number of different factors that we saw both within our core vehicle performance data sets. So those were things like driving speed and total distance and driving time, as well as some location related characteristics. So that would be things like congestion or terrain. So the road grade that you might see in that region. So from all of these different variables, we were able to predict or determine the top features from our data set that predict operational range. And those were average driving speed, the amount of congestion in the city in which the fleet was located, the average ambient temperature, the total distance, and then to a much lesser degree, driving time, the vehicle model year, and idling time percentage. So these are characteristics that really influence that operational range in practice. Next slide, please. All right, so using this model, we did some predictions to see what efficiency and operational range might look like under varying conditions. So our first example was an analysis in which we projected operational range for each day of a year for an example transit bus model in 4 different US cities. So those cities were Los Angeles, Louisville, Kentucky, Missoula, Montana, and Chicago, Illinois. So what we found under this model was that for this imaginary vehicle based on data that we already had that trained the model, we found that range significantly reduces in cold temperatures with a varying extent geographically. And congestion is also a strong limiting factor. So here we're going to look specifically at 2 different cities, Los Angeles and Missoula. So Los Angeles had a very consistent temperature throughout the whole year, not much winter variation, relatively mild. And it also has high congestion levels, which results in having reduced speed and greater idling times because of all of that start and stop traffic. So in LA, what we noticed was that the operational range, which is shown in our blue dots in these plots, operational range did not vary very much throughout the year in LA. However, it almost always was less than the nominal range, which is shown in the red dashed line. And this is likely because of congestion. Those real world conditions make it so that the vehicle can't operate at the speed that it might under lab conditions. In Missoula, there was lower congestion. So in the summer months when temperature was mild, warm, not as extremely cold, we saw that occasionally the projected operational range actually surpassed that nominal range value. So those were ideal conditions. In winter, however, winters in Missoula are quite cold, and during these months, the projected operational range was actually much, much lower than that nominal range, as you can see in the left and right part of that Missoula plot in the bottom left corner. So we can note that temperature and congestion really affect vehicle performance, and temperature and congestion varies quite a bit across the United States in different cities. In this analysis, congestion was a constant variable for a location. So we were just looking at the annual hours of delay that were seen in that city. So it's not the most granular variable, but it was important. Next slide, please. Looking more at congestion and duty cycle, we looked at some example trucks. So here we projected what operational range might look like for every day of a year for the same heavy duty truck model in the same city, Louisville, Kentucky. But it was traveling on 2 different duty cycles. So first, local haul, less than 100 miles per day, and second, regional haul, which is 100 to 300 miles per day. What we saw was that for the same example vehicle model, we projected that the regional haul vehicle would have a relatively high range, close to the nominal range throughout the year. Occasionally, it would drop to about 60% of the nominal range in extreme cases, but generally close. The local haul truck, which had much more idling, much greater percentage of idling time, a much lower driving speed, and fewer driving hours and miles while still running around the same amount of time per day, those local haul trucks had very low, well, no, relatively low operational range relative to that nominal range. As you can see in the left plot, it is much lower. It's around 150 miles of operational range relative to that 230 predicted nominal range. So fleets should expect this. If you are a local haul trucking fleet, it might be good to deploy trucks with a nominal range double the expected daily range, just to ensure that you can meet that daily range route need. So that was an important finding from this model. Next slide, please. All right, so now I'll pass it back off to Mark, who's going to share some of our survey results from this project. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Christina. Great job at presenting on the data findings. So now we're going to move into our survey results. So we reached out to a few of the fleets in the study and got some, feedback from them on how their actually operations are going with their EVs. In this part of the presentation, I just want to touch on a few findings that was mentioned by the fleets in regards to weather impacts, elevation or terrain, and then also with their drivers in regards to range anxiety. So next slide, please. So some discoveries from the field, again, decreased range due to weather impacts. So a few fleets had mentioned that they were having these issues. So we had a school bus fleet operator in the West region found that AC can reduce range by 10%, and the heater can reduce the range by 15%. So not a huge finding there, but that was noted. Or not a huge difference in, the decreased range, but we pointed that out because it does take a factor in on the amount of range that would be usable if you're operating these utilities. So a transit bus fleet operator in the Midwest found that during very cold weather, the energy consumption rate increased to about 3.2 kilowatts per mile, whereas the ambient temperature, when the ambient temperatures were between 60 and 70 degrees, so pretty normal warm day, the energy consumption rate decreased to 1.6 kilowatts per mile. So again, going back to what Christina presented earlier, a 3.2 kilowatt per mile is less efficient than a 1.6 kilowatt hour per mile. So, that's a 50% efficiency delta. So just wanted to point that out, like cold weather does very much impact the performance of these vehicles. We also found that a school bus operator in the Midwest had a downtime issues whenever temperatures went below 35 degrees due to difficulties charging. Next slide, please. All right, some more discoveries. Insufficient performance due to terrain impacts. So there was a transit bus fleet operator in the Midwest. They had first generation buses that couldn't handle hills in the fleet service areas. So that's a huge impact there. Then there's also the driver's low confidence in range ability. There was a school bus fleet operator in the West region mentioned that drivers would not know if it would make it back from their route due to range anxiety. Now, these are the impacts that the fleets were experiencing. So there were some actions that the fleets did take and some recommendations that we could provide in regards to, weather impacts, terrain, and range anxiety. So next slide, please. So combating weather impacts. So fleets made mention to ensure that the battery is fully charged to full capacity on colder days, even if the current SOC would be able to meet the energy usage for the route. Also, early EV adopting fleets did recommend to have a high ICE to EV spare ratio to ensure operations aren't fully impacted. So those are some ways you could combat weather, making sure the battery's charged, and then just in case, have a high ICE to EV ratio while the technology is advancing to be more reliable. Next slide, please. So overcoming difficult terrain. There, in the instance of the fleet couldn't make it up their hills. It wasn't providing enough power for their service area. So what they did was they sent their EVs back. So they purchased EVs that had a larger electric motor, which was powerful enough to handle steep elevation. There was another fleet that we interviewed that their vehicles had hill assist. So that's also an option that would provide overcoming difficult terrain. So another was we discussed drivers' range anxiety. So restoring drivers' confidence and range ability. You could provide drivers with training on how to properly use regenerative braking to take advantage of increasing range when applicable, such as on hill descents. Also consider installing a level 3 DC fast charger, which takes considerably less time to fully charge the EV, ensuring operations start with a full range. So those are some of the things that you could overcome those barriers or obstacles regarding weather impacts, terrain, and range anxiety. So next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it off to David. He's going to give some more takeaways on the fleet's interviews for our management staff, drivers, as well as the maintenance staff.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so we got on the phone and in some cases went down to the office when they were local of some of the fleets that participated in this study. And really what we wanted to do was sort of get the human side, the operational side, and capture any sort of data, however anecdotal, about how these folks who are operating these vehicles felt about the vehicles in ways that weren't captured in the telematics data or the survey data through CALSTART. So we talked to three groups of folks. We talked to management staff, to drivers, and to maintenance staff, and got some really great feedback from all three groups in interviews with over a dozen of these fleets. The management staff in general were, the folks who's had a good high-level overview understanding of the fleet operations and had some really good conversations with them. And in general, they were very satisfied from a managerial perspective about EVs. There's no fleet yet that is managing a fleet solely of EVs. So, they're working with two different types of powertrains, or sometimes three if they have natural gas in addition to diesel and electric in those mixed fleets. Despite those growing pains with the new technology and the support infrastructure, the charging infrastructure that they have to have on hand. EVs have been up to most tasks and routes asked of them. As Mark mentioned, a few fleets had to return their EVs to their makers to get more power. There were some fleets who were dealing with ice, some dealing with steep hills. But once they got larger, more powerful motors to power those rear axles, they were back on the road and doing really well. And fleet managers were really quick at becoming flexible and adept about working around decreased range due to climate extremes. We talked to some fleets in the upper Midwest who, are dealing with some of the coldest winters they've had, and really were good at making sure that their drivers were in communication with them and making sure that they worked around their decreased range when it got really cold, sometimes below zero. And then in general, they want higher range vehicles to sort of work with some of that needed flexibility due to range impacts during temperature extremes on the low and high end. But they're able to work with what's available now and what they have now in their fleets. They also mentioned that some additional costs that have come up with EVs are demand charges for EV charging, especially when they have to charge during the day or the afternoon, and potential higher insurance costs versus their internal combustion engine counterparts in their fleets. As far as drivers go, they had universally positive reviews and responses of driving these EVs. A lot of these EVs come with air conditioning as standard, which is not true of their internal combustion engine or diesel counterparts, so they love that. And they also have a very smooth ride. So the drivers are all very gung ho and very excited and provided good reviews about driving these vehicles, which isn't necessarily something that I expected going in. So that was really great. Drivers also usually received some training from the OEMs about route management and tend to play a more active role with their managers in optimizing the routes that EVs took, especially to work around range decreases during winter and summer. And also, most drivers start their routes with full batteries. They only use depot charging. They're not using opportunity charging yet in the vast majority of cases, is what they reported to us. Next slide. And then as far as maintenance staff goes, these were some really interesting conversations. Maintenance managers, told us that EVs usually demand less time to repair, which as we all know, they have far fewer moving parts and, no exhaust systems, fueling systems, et cetera. No rebuilding, coming straight sixes with these. But time spent seeking OEM support and parts often erase that benefit. We're talking about, some small manufacturers, some startup manufacturers that don't necessarily have techs in every corner of the country. So getting someone to address a software issue or deliver a part can take a lot longer than with a legacy manufacturer. So while the vehicles were more reliable and tended to break down less, a software issue could erase that benefit fairly quickly. Vehicle powertrains also are generally reliable, and software issues that are only fixable by dealership technicians or by traveling techs can extend downtime when it's not necessarily necessary due to the problem. And most maintenance staff also received some degree of training from OEMs, just like the driver, but some experienced opacity in training, especially when it's how to access software, vehicle diagnostics. There wasn't always that openness from manufacturers that would have allowed on-staff maintenance people to get those issues sorted out themselves without resorting to contacting the manufacturer. When parts were needed by maintenance techs, long lead times were fairly common and could turn, a short job that would only take, a little bit to get remedied into a multi-day process. But a lot foresaw that issue would lessen with wider adoption and with more vehicles and hence more parts production. Finally, a higher spare ratio employed theoretically for EVs, as Mark mentioned. Most fleets use ICE vehicles to fill in the gaps when EVs are down, and they're not really thinking yet about an EV spare ratio for EVs. But in the future, that may be higher due to these reasons. Next slide. All right, I'll pass this back over to Mark.
Okay, thanks, David. So all in all, what we found throughout the data side as well as the qualitative side, there's some key findings. So medium and heavy duty performs 3 to 6 times as efficiently as diesels, resulting in substantial energy cost saving. So greater mileage equals greater operational cost savings. Fleet should account for reduced operational range in colder months. About 30% operational range decrease predicted for transit buses in the Missoula winter months. Fuel fry heaters may be required in colder climates in order to meet range requirements. Local haul truck, which is a less than or greater than 100 miles a day, less than 100 miles a day. Fleets may need to deploy trucks with nearly 2 times the expected daily range to meet extreme duty cycle conditions. And driver training is essential to maximize performance. So current and future deployments should include telematics in order to assess and maximize performance and increase understanding across the industry. So next slide, we have our Q&A, and to wrap it up. Oh, sorry. Go back to the last slide. So yeah, these provide you access, these QR codes. You could get access to our current dashboard on this project, which has is tracking all of the metrics on vehicle days in service, miles tracked, and breaking everything out by the vehicle platforms. And then on the right, we have a link to where you could actually download the raw data that was collected from these fleets and to do further research. So these are two tools that you could use to do research or provide in your organization or to another organization. But it's available for public use. Next slide, we have our Q&A and yeah, open it up here for everyone.
Also, if you have any questions and would prefer not to do them live, you can throw them in the chat as well, and we can address those. I actually have one question for you guys at CalSTART. So you mentioned that you have sort of a long relationship with some of these fleets that you had even before this study started. What comes next after this? With any of these fleets, are you sort of maintaining a relationship, continuing to collect data, anything like that?
Yeah, so from my knowledge, some of these fleets that we had already collected data with, it was because of various grants that we'd received and funding. So a lot of that funding was time-based, and a lot of that has ended. As a result, the data collection has ended. There might be some fleets that we might still collect data with. I don't know a lot on that end. I think Mark or Lily, if you're here, can provide more information on that. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll unmute for a second, chime in with a little bit more information from the fleet side. I work in our Midwest regional office here at CalSTART and worked with a lot of the fleets on this project. As Christina captured, we do typically have a lot of our work funded from different grants. So we do have timelines for the data collection and reporting that we can do, but we do frequently partner with the fleets repeatedly. Like we had fleets within this project that we had worked with previously, weren't doing data collection because it wasn't an option when we first deployed vehicles with them or started working with them. So we brought them back in for this project to do data collection. We've gone into other grants with them. So as they keep getting new vehicles, we continue with that. We do additional assessments with more total cost of ownership work as they keep going. So the relationship sometimes shifts depending on what they need or what we're able to do at the time, but we do typically keep in touch with our fleet contacts, especially through use of a lot of working groups.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Got a question from Ron in the chat. Hey, Ron, nice to see you. Do you have any data for any medium or heavy duty vehicle types for cold weather months in the Northeast? Yeah, I know we worked with at least one school bus fleet in the Northeast. Christina, do you have any other insights?
Yes. School bus, I don't know that school bus fleet is in this data set, actually, but we have 2 trucking fleets in the Northeast, one of which we are still waiting on the final data set from, and when that's uploaded, well, it'll be uploaded within the next 2 weeks, within the next week or so, before the project end date. But yeah, so 2 trucking fleets by end of project, and they did have winter data collection as well. So, because for each of these fleets, we received a whole year of data. So you're going to have that seasonal variation included. Yeah, we didn't have any transit fleets or school bus fleets in the Northeast, though, I believe. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And results. Yeah, so again, we're waiting on that last fleet. When we have our Northeast, our full Northeast cold weather data set, we could share those results. It'll all be in the project dashboard by the end of the project, and on that Livewire site. So currently we don't have the full winter results from those fleets, but yeah, it'll be there. And link. Yes, I'll share the link to Livewire and the dashboard in the chat. Let me pull those up.
Yeah, I just want to also add that the DOE is always putting out like opportunities for grants to for further research. So there may be an opportunity to continue this type of research in the future, based off of, if we're able to justify why additional data is needed, or how we could contribute to the current data set that we have, and carry out another study like this.
Absolutely. Great. Well, if there are no other questions, I guess we can wrap on up. The recording of this will be posted in just a little bit on ECC's website if you want to watch it back later or share with your colleagues. Just want to thank everyone again. Thank Christina and Mark for your really great presentations today and for really doing this really critical work. I'm sure this is work that'll be looked at for a while in the future. Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, David, and thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
David. Thank you, everyone.